Today on Sports Card Investor University, we're telling you everything you need to know about the current state of grading, including which grading companies are best to use for which types of cards. Hello, sports card investors, and welcome to a special episode of Sports Card University, where we are bringing you up to speed on everything you need to know about grading. And to do that, I brought in a grading expert, the great Joe Davis from Got Baseball Cards. Joe, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here, Jeff. Loving the new studio. Great to be here.
Appreciate it. Joe has been on our show many times over the last couple of years. He's got a great card shop here in the Atlanta, Georgia area, does a ton of sales both locally and online. But one thing Joe also does a lot of through his store is a ton of grading submissions. And he's been doing it for a long time. So he's got all of the knowledge to bring to you today and all of the relationships with all of the different grading companies, so we can give you the inside on what all of these different companies are doing at the moment. But first, let me remind you, this episode is brought to you by eBay. eBay is here for the card collectors with a trick for every trade, like advanced tools for price checking with Price Guide Beta within the eBay app, and up to 50% faster listing with Image Scan. Learn how collecting just got smarter at ebay.com/trading hub. All right, Joe, I think a good place for us to start our conversation today is why is grading important in the first place, and why is it still relevant today and actually perhaps more relevant than ever before?
Well, Jeff, I've been in the hobby as a collector since the 70s as a kid, but very seriously since the late 80s. And I remember back in the 80s, pre-grading, you could often get burned at a card show. You would buy a card, then you get home with it and you go, wait a minute, this card's been altered. It's been trimmed or it's been recolored, the border's been recolored. So it protects collectors. Grading helps provide authenticity to the card. It's also it's a counterfeit detection as well as alteration detection. So that's the very first step before we even talk about the grade itself. It protects collectors to know that what they're buying is an unaltered card.
Yeah, and as a sports card investor, I mean, that's extremely important, right? I mean, if you're going to put your money into cards and are buying those cards because you think they may go up in value over the long term, you've got to know it's the real deal. And another very important aspect that grading brings is it brings a consistency in quality. It gives you an understanding of the quality of what a card is. And in this day and age, a lot of cards are bought online where you don't have the opportunity to closely inspect the condition of the card beforehand. So in my opinion, buying graded cards, if you're doing investing, buying graded cards is absolutely pivotal so that you can ensure the quality.
Yes, exactly. And each company has their own different standards, and you can argue back and forth. But in general, like if you only buy PSA cards, you pretty much know what an 8 is going to look like. You pretty much know what a 9, what the standards are going to be. And that varies company to company a little bit. But in general, you know the kind of standard quality you're going to receive depending on what grade you're purchasing.
Yeah, and being a person who's really into looking at sports card data and analytics and what cards have done over time in the marketplace, I also really like graded cards for that reason, because of that consistency of quality, it gives you nice, clean trend lines to follow when looking at charts of the price changes of cards. For example, if you go into our Sports Card Investor app, or if you go into our Market Movers product, which allows you to chart the price changes of cards, if you look at cards in raw condition, which our apps have a bunch of cards in raw condition, but the chart lines are typically more jagged. And the reason is because the actual condition of the card can vary wildly from a card that's kind of beat up with, dinged corners to a card that's perfectly sharp. So you see these raw condition graphs and they can bounce all over the place. But if you look at a graph of that same card in, let's say, PSA 10 condition, you're going to see a lot more of a true consistent trend line to show you how the value of that card has evolved over time, because of the fact that the condition is consistent between all of the different sales of that particular card.
Right. As I tell customers all the time, once you get your card graded, you will then know the true liquid value, because you can quickly look on eBay once you have that card back in hand and you go, oh, this SGC 9 sells for blank, or this PSA 10 sells for this at that time, and on eBay, and so, or whatever app you're looking at. So grading gives it actual immediate liquid value.
Yeah, it does. So grading is obviously very important, and perhaps more important today than ever before, with a lot of people like you and me who have gotten into sports cards from an investing standpoint. But there are a lot of different companies that do grading, and a lot has changed with those companies. And in fact, yes, Joe and I have done a few of these videos over the years about grading, but even since the last time we did it, the world has changed dramatically. Yes. PSA went from being an ideal option for all types of cards, even low-end cards, to now, at this moment at least, only having very high-end service levels available in a
Correct.
pretty high price point.
Yes.
We've seen BGS go through changes. We've seen SGC go through dramatic changes of their own, and their own price point oscillate quite a bit. And then we've seen other newer companies come in, like CSG, who's been in other forms of grading for a long time, but recently came into cards.
Right.
And then upstarts like HGA and others. So a lot of landscape to cover. And let's start by talking about some of those companies and what has gone on, what the future looks like, and when it may be appropriate to use them versus another company.
Sure.
So let's start with PSA.
Sure.
PSA is the big dog out there right now. And by the way, as we get into this conversation, let me mention that we have a bulk submission program to submit your graded cards to through Joe and Got Baseball Cards, where you actually get special pricing through a lot of these companies we're going to talk about today. In some cases, better pricing than you can get by going direct. And Joe, you represent most of these companies in some respects.
Yeah,
so it's
four companies we work with. Yes.
So we're getting a full picture. We're not trying to steer you in the direction of just any one grading company, because that's who Joe grades with. Rather, he represents a lot of these companies. And so he's got a lot of experience with all of them. But if you are interested in submitting your cards through our bulk submission program, you can go to sportscardinvestor.com and click on grading in the main menu bar and read all about that and see all of the great pricing. Yep. So PSA, they're the gorilla in the industry. They've been the gorilla in the industry for a while. They still lead the market in terms of resale value of a PSA 10 compared to a gem mint grade with any of the other grading companies, and they lead there by far. However, it's now a lot more expensive to grade through PSA than it's ever been before, and that changes the landscape. What has gone on with PSA, and where do you think things are going from here?
Well, since their shutdown earlier this year, they'd fallen so far behind. They shut down at the end of March, and then since that time, they have slowly opened up some other levels, very slowly, according to most people, but they're trying to work through the massive backlog of the millions and millions of cards that they had fallen behind on getting graded. So right now, according to Nat Turner, he's been stating that they're processing about 40,000 cards per day right now to try to cut into the backlog. However, their cheapest pricing is still at the Super Express and Express level. So you're paying $150 plus shipping out there, shipping back, insuring and everything. And that's even if you're going direct. You're still paying quite a fee per card. We hope to see other levels open up. By the end of this year, we hope to see maybe like a $100 level or $110 level. None of that's been announced yet. We're just making projections based upon how many cards they are turning, and they're kind of slowly working down the ladder as to when they'll get back to the really cheap $20 type price point. I think we've got a long way to go. Yeah,
and at one point it was reported that backlog was in excess of 10 million cards.
Yeah, I heard 13 at one point.
13 million.
What I heard.
So the fact, they're going through 40,000 cards per day, and that's a lot greater volume of cards that they're getting through today than they were several months ago when they first, shut down a lot of their service levels. But if you think about it, a 13 million card backlog, even going through 40,000 cards per day, and considering more cards are still being submitted to them every single day at these high levels, it's going to take a while for them to get all the way through, those cards in their backlog. I mean, so it may be, as you said, we may be talking more than a year before they're able to get their price point down to anywhere close to what it used to be for bulk submission. And that's if they can ever even do it. Because I will tell you, I've got a whole stack of cards that I'm kind of sitting on waiting for PSA's price point to eventually get lower again before I submit. And I know there's, thousands of other collectors and investors out there who are sitting on piles waiting for PSA to get lower service levels as well. So every time they come down to a lower price point, they're likely to get another flood of cards, which is then just going to add to the backlog and kind of perpetuate this, level of being behind.
Right. Well, let's talk numbers. The shutdown was about 8 months ago when they suspended most services. We still have over 50,000 cards out there.
At PSA.
At PSA.
That have been submitted through you.
Yeah, dating back to last November.
Gosh.
So a year old. And this is after they've shut down most services for 8 months. So Nat Turner's made it very clear that they want to get to a point, they're trying to ramp up capacity. They want to get to a point where inflow and outflow are about equal. Right now, of course, they're working on the backlog, and they'll slowly come down the ladder in prices to where they get to a point where they can balance what's coming in with what's going out. He has stated recently that he hopes to see capacity hit 80,000 cards per day by the end of 2022. So even so, you look back, he stated that January, February, March of 2021, they were taking in 100,000 cards per day and hit one day with 660,000. So those numbers don't, you're talking about even back then, and demand, there's so much pent-up demand now. Think about how many they might be taking in now if the numbers were more affordable.
Those are incredible numbers. I mean, those numbers tell me that you might not see, true lower cost PSA submissions, sub $50 submissions become available. 2023, 2024, I mean, who knows, even longer than that. So I guess an important lesson here for sports card investors is for lower end cards, especially for ultra modern lower end cards of players who maybe are hot now or are going to be hot soon, you may not be able to, you may not want to afford to wait until PSA eventually reopens for lower service levels. You may also not want to afford to pay the high fees that PSA is currently charging for express submissions. The express submissions make sense if you have a card that has a whole lot of value.
Right.
But if you're pulling cards out of the current year Prism release or Select and their base cards or inexpensive parallels, if you're going to wait for PSA, you might be waiting a couple of years. If you're going to submit to PSA, you're going to be way overpaying potentially.
Right.
So then, of course, it comes down to, well, what do you do with those other grading companies? We're going to talk about some of those other grading companies in a minute. But before we do, just to kind of wrap up the PSA conversation, what are the appropriate cards for somebody to submit to PSA today, given where things are currently at, their current price points, et cetera?
I mean, we look at it internally, and what we quote to customers is we say, if you've got say a $500 raw card value, $600 raw card value, and you think it's got a good shot at a 10, then you can probably come out ahead going with PSA. But and there's exceptions. There's some cheaper ones which may bring a premium in a 10, like a really tough condition card. But in general, when customers come in and they've got a $20 Prism rookie or a $50 Prism rookie, we advise them, we're like, it's going to be really hard to make your money back at the current cost of grading. So they've got to weigh other options. And we explain to them, yes, PSA is the best resale. However, you've got to factor in the price difference of what you're paying there versus others right now. And before we wrap up on PSA, I do want to say Nat Turner has stated his long-term goal is to get back to the old price points where they were at. He's made it clear that he wants people to be able to send in, their cheaper price cards. It's just a matter of how quickly can they ramp up capacity to achieve that, whether it's the end of next year or the following year. That remains to be seen. That is their goal, and I take him at his word that they want to get to that eventually, but I just think it's probably going to take longer than a lot of collectors are hoping for.
Yeah, it could be a pretty long road, indeed. Now, if you're buying cards on the secondary market that are already graded, PSA 10s actually hold more of a premium today than they ever have before. We are seeing in our data, looking at market movers and the price trends of different cards, PSA 10 continues to separate itself from BGS 9.5, which is BGS's gem mint grade. It's supposedly the equivalent of the PSA 10, but the PSA 10 continues to separate itself. And also, you've got others on the secondary market like SGC and CSG, but even in 10 conditions, they're not there compared to PSA 10.
Right.
In fact, in most cases, they're nowhere close to there.
Yeah.
So from a long-term investability standpoint, PSA 10s are still king. They are still the thing that most collectors and investors desire. So if you're buying on the secondary market, it's a great place to look. But if you're trying to get them graded yourself, that's when these really tough decisions come into play today about what to do.
Correct. Yeah, it's a numbers game.
Yeah.
And you just got to put it on paper and say, if I'm paying X per card to grade, what does my return need to be? And so that's what we help customers do, every day, and help them make those decisions.
So let's talk about another company that has been a company that's been grading for a long time, that has been popular, within the hobby for many, many years with grading, and that's Beckett. And Beckett has their BGS grading service, and that's for cards that are modern, cards from the last 30 or so years. And then they've got Beckett Vintage Grading for cards that are older, BVG, I believe it's called.
Yep.
But in either case, it's Beckett's grading service, and they do a big volume of cards. They're a popular choice with sports card investors and collectors as well. But they too have gone through similar scale problems as PSA. And I know you represent Beckett, and over the years have sent tons of cards to them as well to grade. What are we seeing with them today?
They too are shut down for all their lowest level services and have been for quite a while. They too are slowly opening up other services. They were only doing their premium. Now they're down to their express, so you're talking like $100 price point without subgrades. So over time, I hope they too will be opening up. I know that's their goal. They want to offer affordable grading as well. Beckett does a great job. Love their holders. Beautiful cards. Some Beckett's had some world records set. Some cards in their holders, as well as PSA. And so I think just like PSA, they're working through the backlog. It just shows the incredible demand for graded cards in our industry, that the two best known companies have had to shut down most of their services for a long period of time now. So I think they'll slowly roll out other services as they get caught up on their backlog. With BGS right now, I think we're about 6 months behind on our oldest submissions right now, relative to being a year behind on PSA.
Yeah, okay, so a little more caught up, I guess, than PSA. Why would you today choose to use BGS for a card submission, let's say, over PSA?
Well, BGS is very strong in the modern card market. People love, the auto grades. And the one thing that BGS has that PSA does not have is the possibility to hit that pristine 10 grade. And the ultimate is the pristine black label, which is, all 10 subgrades. And a lot of people do love the subgrades that PSA does not offer. So that's one big differentiator between BGS and PSA. If you want the subgrades, and you happen to get a 9.5 with some 10 subgrades, that can bring a premium. And certainly if you get a pristine 10 from BGS or a black label 10, that can bring a premium over a PSA 10 card.
Yeah, and so just to make sure everyone understands the grading scale there, the most common gem mint grade from BGS is a 9.5, and that is supposed to kind of be the equivalent of the PSA 10 in the terms that they're both gem mint. But unlike PSA, BGS offers two higher grades, which are very, very rare to get. It's the Pristine 10 and then the Pristine 10 Black Label, the Black Label 10. Those are very, very difficult to get, and therefore they do command a premium over the PSA 10. But most of the time, if you're getting a gem mint through Beckett, you're getting the 9.5. The subgrades is where they give you an individual score for the 4 different aspects that they grade a card on. So they're looking at the corners, they're looking at the edges, they're looking at the centering, and they're looking at the surface. We're going to talk about all 4 of those and how to evaluate a card a little bit more later in this episode, but they're grading each of those components individually and then merging those grades together to give you an overall grade for the card, whereas PSA just gives you an overall grade and they don't give you the subgrades. Personally, I like BGS if there is a card that you look at and you think this card probably won't quite PSA 10. then I think BGS is a great option, particularly for a thicker card, a patch card. They're very popular for people who are grading patch cards, RPAs, rookie patch autos, cards that have pieces of jersey or memorabilia in them, because those cards are often very tough to get a PSA 10 because there's just more surface area and more things going on with the card, more edges, more opportunity for something to have a slight defect that would prevent it from not getting a perfect grade. But with BGS, because they do the subgrades, they may knock it down in surface, but you still may get a really good grade in the other areas like corners and edges and centering and that type of thing. And it actually may all average out to a 9.5 potentially. Or even if you only get like a 9 with BGS, you at least get a little more of a description with the subgrades to explain what the defect with the card is. Whereas with PSA, you don't. So I prefer BGS oftentimes for the thicker cards, particularly ones that are not in absolutely perfect condition.
And also BGS is, I believe, the only one doing the booklet cards. PSA is not doing them, BGS is, and we've had customers send in even the triple booklets, the really long ones, and BGS grades those, so they're very popular, with customers to submit to BGS as well.
Yeah. So definitely some good options there. What do you expect in terms of future trajectory with BGS? Are they kind of like PSA? They got a long way to go before it fully opens back up to take bulk submissions again?
Yeah, I think so. I think they have a lot of cards out there. I mean, both of them probably in hindsight may have wished they had cut things off sooner because they both got just overrun with cards last year and earlier this year. So I don't know to what degree they're ramping up. I know PSA has stated that they're hiring 10 to 12 people a week right now, trying to add 10 to 12 new people a week to help them with the backlog. I don't know at what pace BGS is going as far as adding people to work on that, but I know that's their goal. They don't want cards sitting there. They don't make money if the cards are just sitting there. So, their ultimate goal is to get them turned, but they want to do it at a speed where they keep the consistency of the grading to where it needs to be. And you can't just hire somebody off the street and go, hey, go start grading cards. So it takes time to educate the graders to do it the right way. And I think both of them want to do it the right way. It's just going to take time. So we just have to tell collectors, be patient. I don't know any definite timelines. They haven't announced anything. But if you really want your card in a PSA holder or a BGS holder, but you don't want to pay the current prices, you're just going to have to hang on a while.
Yeah. Well, your other option is to consider one of the other grading companies. And a really interesting one to talk about is SGC. SGC is a company that has actually been in business for a very long time and was popular with grading really old vintage cards for quite a while. Real popular with like pre-war cards and everything like that. But recently, they've made a big push to become a preferred grader for modern and ultra-modern cards as well. They've scaled their operation up tremendously. And in fact, earlier this year, they allowed us at Sports Card Investor to do a whole episode where we took our cameras behind the scenes at SGC and we showed off their entire grading process. And I'll tell you, I was impressed by that visit down into their headquarters in Florida. They had made an incredible effort. I think they had scaled from less than 10 employees to more than 100 employees as of when we had done that video over the course of, I think it was just about a year's time that they had gone from 10 to over 100 doing grading. Their capacity continues to grow. We submit a lot of cards to them through our bulk submission service, the Sports Card Investor bulk submission service with Got Baseball Cards, in part because we actually get a little better pricing for our audience than they can get by going direct to SGC. So they become a popular option for us. They become a popular option for our audience. Their price point right now is currently $30 a card or less if you submit a bunch of cards at a time.
Through us, right?
Only through our bulk submission service at Sports Card Investor. Again, go to the grading page on our website, sportscardinvestor.com, if you want more info on that. And because of that price point, which has remained low during a time period when PSA and BGS obviously are dealing with $100 plus price points, and because of the fact that SGC is also turning the orders around very fast in a matter of a few weeks in most cases, they've become a really popular option recently.
Yes.
What is your perspective on SGC right now?
We have been thrilled working with SGC. They've done a phenomenal job in turning orders quickly. Even as they are increasing the volume they're taking in, they've still been able to get stuff back to us in 6 to 8 weeks. It's a little slower than it was, but it's because of the volume they're taking in. But the customer service has been outstanding. They've been great to work with. And I have personally started sending them a lot of cards from collections we've bought, especially vintage. We just bought a large vintage 50s and 60s era collection, and we've sent them hundreds of cards from that collection. And we've seen resale improving. Obviously, they're still not up to PSA, but we have seen, on the vintage especially, we have seen very strong resale. I mean, a lot of the stuff, when we get it back, we're comping it at PSA numbers when we put it out for sale on eBay, and we take offers, and often it's very close to PSA comps. Again, they're much stronger on the vintage side than the modern, but they are working on that as well. And as far as what we're seeing come in from submitters, we're seeing a large volume, both modern and vintage as well.
Yeah, and we track in our Sports Card Investor app and in Market Movers, we track SGC sales for a whole bunch of cards alongside PSA and BGS. And what we're seeing is, while the prices still aren't there, they're still not rivaling BGS or PSA prices right now in terms of resale, we are seeing the volume increase a lot. We're seeing a lot more SGC cards on the market. And I do think over the long run, that having just a lot more presence out there on the market, a lot more cards for sale on eBay, and a lot more data within tracking products like Market Movers and the Sports Card Investor app will ultimately start to help the resale value. And I think you probably will see SGC edge a lot closer to those other cards.
Right.
What do you think about their standards of grading? Have you noticed any appreciable difference between how they're grading a card versus how you might expect, a PSA or a BGS to grade that card?
To be honest, they've been very strict. I mean, I've been disappointed in my own submissions in the sense like, wow, they're really tough on some of these. But on modern, I had one customer who submitted several hundred modern, and his words that he got a lot of 9.5s, which on their scale is a mint plus. He said, whereas he thinks he would be getting 10s at PSA. So again, that's his opinion, and that was one submitter. But I can tell you they're not easy. And I say that by meaning that if you're a buyer on SGC cards, understand if you're buying a 9, you're getting a mint card. If you're buying a 10, you're getting a gem mint card by most standards. So they're definitely not handing out 10s that way. I mean, it's a very legitimate standard they're following. Yeah.
So I think as people begin to see more of that by buying SGC cards, then that should probably continue to help improve their resale values on the secondary market.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So right now, given the current landscape, you talked a little bit about this, but what would you suggest people submit through SGC today? What types of cards?
I think they're a perfect option for vintage. Whether it be high grade, low grade, in between. We have sent in a lot of mid 50s, late 50s, minor stars, semi-stars, and major stars to them. For modern, again, we've already talked about PSA is probably the best option on the higher, if you've got this super rare LaMelo, parallel rookie that's hundreds of dollars, you probably still want to go to PSA with that. But, for your Prism rookies that are, it's a $30, $40 base card. It's a logical step to spend $30 on that. It may turn into, a $100 10 or $150 10 or whatever. So there are certainly things both in the vintage and modern market that work very well with SGC, and we're seeing it. We're seeing not only sports, we're seeing Pokemon cards being sent in. We're seeing a lot of Marvel cards have come in to be sent to them. So we're seeing collectors are sending non-sports, sports, all, it runs the gamut of what people are starting to use SGC for.
Yeah, fascinating. There's another company that has also been around for a long time grading other types of collectibles, and that's CSG. CSG, big in the comic book world.
And coins.
Yeah. And then recently got into sports cards, and they're really trying to push into sports cards in a big way. One of the interesting things about CSG is they're backed by Blackstone, which is a big financial private equity fund conglomerate company that's infused money into them. And Blackstone's also been involved in Fanatics. And so what's interesting about that is with Fanatics looking at the possibility of getting into grading down the road,
right.
Does that mean CSG is going to become a preferred grader of Fanatics? Is Fanatics funneling a lot of stuff for CSG for grading? Is that going to raise their popularity within the hobby? Maybe so, as a long-term play.
I think there's a good likelihood.
Yeah.
Not definite, but it's a good likelihood.
Something to think about for the long term. But where are we with CSG today?
CSG, yeah, for those who don't know, as you were saying, CSG's been around since the late 80s. You know, their NGC is their coin grading division, CGC, of course, which is the #1 comic grading company, been around for a long time as well. And so they started off doing comic card, doing gaming. CGC is their card grading for gaming cards, for Magic, Pokemon, etc. And now they've added CSG for sports card grading, and they brought over at least 2 of them. I know, one from BGS, one from PSA, top graders. You know, some of those companies they brought over to help head up the start of their company for their sports card grading division. They started off really cheap. We sent them a lot of cards. They've had to move up in price a little bit, but they're still the cheapest option of any of the companies we work with right now. You can grade Modern with us at $18 a card and a little cheaper in quantity, you know, including grading, shipping, insurance. And their turnaround is slower than SGC right now, but still much quicker than we are experiencing the backlogs from Beckett and PSA. So we're typically seeing about 4 months roughly right now. So they have a beautiful holder. Their holder is very similar in size to PSA, crystal clear. They have a scale similar to BGS in that you can get a 9.5 as a gem mint and a 10 as a pristine. So some people only like to get that 10 grade, and but they use a similar scale to BGS in that sense. They've also been very tough. As we were speaking earlier, we sent a couple thousand cards to them. Same type of cards, same exact cards we had sent some to PSA. The percentages we got back from CSG, we got a lower percentage of 10s than we got from PSA, at least for those cards. You know, that doesn't give you the big picture, but at least for, you know, a sample size of what we got back.
Right. Interesting. Now, I'm going to take a little exception to one thing you said. Personally, I don't like the look of the CSG holders, but that is to each his own. And there's some people that prefer PSA holders. There's some people that prefer BGS holders. There's some people that love the tuxedo look of the SGC holders. And some people like you really like the crystal clear nature of the CSG holders.
It's got to be the label, right?
I hate the label.
Yeah, I have heard that.
I hate the label.
And I've actually talked to them about that. So, you know, they're aware of it. They're well aware of it, that people don't like, they feel like the label's bland and boring and so forth. I like the plastic.
Sure.
But I understand the label. I actually had talks to them at the National about that. We've gotten a lot of complaints about they need to jazz up the label.
Yeah.
So hopefully that'll happen down the road.
We'll see. But, you know, again, to each his own. People look at different grading companies and the slabs. They have different personal preferences on it. Ultimately, what matters from an investment standpoint is what grades you're able to ascertain, and then what the secondary market, how it treats these different companies in relation to each other, and what type of value is there for you to grade through each of these companies. So from a pure price point perspective, at the moment, CSG is the cheapest option if you go through bulk submission through the Sports Card Investor partnership with Got Baseball Cards.
Right. Yeah. And there are things that work there. You know, if you just love to get brand new, you know, you're popping boxes and you want to get cards graded with a respected company as affordably as possible, that's a great option.
Yeah.
You know, I've sent them thousands of cards in the last couple of months myself for long-term investment, because I do think you're going to see them rise in popularity over time as their marketing budget grows and as their name gets out there more, and depending on what happens with Fanatics using them or not using them, you know, remains to be seen. But I think they have very good standards as well, and I think over time more and more people will turn to them as well.
Yeah, and I'm seeing at card shows that I go to more and more CSG slabs on dealer tables at card shows, and a lot more SGC slabs at dealer tables at card shows as well, compared to what I used to see, you know, when I went to these shows pre-pandemic. Back then, it was almost entirely PSA and BGS and nothing else, or of course raw cards.
Right.
Now you're seeing a fair amount of SGC, a fair amount of CSG, and I think as more people see that and become familiar with it, it will likely help the secondary market in terms of their card prices.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a leveling of the playing field between the 4 companies.
Yeah.
The longer PSA and BGS are shut down for their lower level services, more and more people are going to turn to logical alternatives. And as I've told people, I said, if you start using a company, suddenly you become a fan of that company, and you start not only submitting with them, but you say, well, I'm already submitting with them, I might as well start buying their slabs too. So I think we're going to see an overall rise of the other legitimate, respected companies in their overall market values.
So those are the four, I would say, most respected companies overall today. They've got the longest track records.
Right.
But there are several upstarts that have entered the grading world, and more continue to enter the grading world. In fact, I think we're up to something like 12 or 13 different grading companies.
I lose track of them. Yeah,
there's so many. I don't know why they all decide to use 3-letter initials, but they almost all do. One of those companies that came on the scene in the last couple of years and has gained the most momentum out of the upstarts so far is a company called HGA.
Right.
They're out of Tennessee. They've become kind of well known for their colorful labels that can even be customized.
Right.
What is your thought on HGA at the moment?
I guess their labels are really fancy. They're really cool. They've caught on with a lot of younger collectors for that reason. I think it's still too early to tell. I think they need a longer track record to prove what their consistency will be. Can they maintain, the consistency of grading over a long period of time as they scale, as they add more graders? Can they maintain turnaround times? And what does the secondary market show? Are people as a whole going to accept them? Not just a flash in the pan, like, oh, it's a cool holder, I want to buy one. This blue matches the blue on the card. That's cool. I'll put it in my collection. That's not long term. I walked by HGA's booth at the National, and they didn't know who I was, didn't know who I worked with, and their sales rep just said, "Hey man, check out our holders," and that was his sales point, was check out our holders. He didn't mention anything about, hey, our grading standards are this. This is, if you want to get a mint grade with us, it's got to be this kind. It was just his whole sales pitch was about their holder. And that kind of took me aback. Like, I want to know about the quality of your grading standards. And so, again, that was just one sales rep. That doesn't mean that's what they do their whole sales pitches on. So I'm not bashing them in any way. I'm just saying I think it's too early to know.
Yeah. So, I mean, for a personal collection standpoint, if your intention is to get cards slabbed because you want to display them in your personal collection, if you don't care that much about the investment value of a particular card, for that they can be a good option, because you can get a label that you might find to be more attractive. You can get them graded relatively inexpensively. But from an investment standpoint, our recommendation right now is stay away. From an investment standpoint, consider using one of the other four companies instead, because there's just more of a track record, more of a reputation,
right,
and a known commitment to quality as far as grading standards. And HGA has had some challenges recently where they've slabbed some cards that were not authentic, but they got through their process and got slabbed. They've had some other challenges where they've sent orders to customers and the slabs were not properly sealed. And so these are growing pains that any new grading company goes through, but you may not want to get caught in those growing pains, especially if you've got a higher dollar card that you are thinking about from an investment standpoint.
Yeah, a year from now, we may have a completely different take on it. But
sure,
it's very early. They're in their infancy still.
Yeah.
So,
and there's a lot of other upstarts. Transparent Grading Team, Transparent Grading Company is one that I met recently at a card show. I've met several new grading upstarts at card shows recently doing interesting things. A lot of them are focused around the idea of trying to bring more transparency to the grading process, or trying to use artificial intelligence in the grading process, both of which I think are really cool things. And although I don't know how any of these individual upstart grading companies are necessarily going to do in the long run, I do like the differentiation in thought that they're bringing to the table and how they're pushing for certain things, like more transparency as to why cards were graded as they were. I like those concepts, and I hope that puts some pressure on the big four to incorporate a little bit of that into their processes as well.
Yeah, Nat Turner just spoke about that. He said, there's certain areas of AI that you can use in the grading process, such as measuring centering or detecting counterfeit, stuff like that. But he said, there's just certain elements that have to have the human touch. They know that certain cards were cut just off a different, you have to allow for it on a certain issue, but not on another, and so forth. And there's just certain intangibles that are really hard to this day to build into AI, though they could certainly help, tell you the centering immediately, rather than having to be measured by hand. So I agreed. Anything that these new upstarts do that push the others to increase, their expertise and the way they do things to make them better, okay, in that sense, competition's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Okay, so someone sitting out there right now who's got a pile of cards. If you've got a pile of cards that you're thinking about, I need to get these graded. And now we've just covered the different grading companies, so now hopefully you have a little bit of a better sense of which grading company may be the right choice for you. But how should people go about knowing if it's worth grading their cards at all? Because one thing that I can tell you I made a mistake on when I first got back into sports card collecting and investing is I had a pile of cards and I assumed, just shoved them and said, let me get a bunch of these graded. And I was surprised when they didn't all come back as PSA 10s or even PSA 9s. And I was surprised, and then I quickly came to realize that I actually made a mistake by getting them graded at all, because I paid more for the grading fee. And in some cases, you can actually end up hurting the value of the card.
Right.
If it's a low PSA grade on an ultra modern card, then not only did you pay a grading fee for no gain, but actually the card in a slab as like a PSA 7 is probably worth less than I could have resold the card for simply raw condition on the secondary market. So how can someone make that judgment at home as to whether it's worth submitting a card to get graded or not?
It's tough. That's why we offer free pre-screening for customers, because we have people send us cards and they say, I think these are good cards, but I really don't know how to gauge condition. And so we have a great team that pre-screens, eliminates cards for different reasons. If a person's just sitting at home and they're trying to decide, I tell them to start with what is the raw card value, because the higher the raw card value, the better likelihood it's still going to be worth submitting, even if it's a little bit lower condition. If you've got cards and raw card values only $4 or $5, you better be really good. You better have a really good eye, because those $4 or $5 cards, sometimes in a 10, still aren't going to cover the value of grading.
Right.
So I always say start with raw value, then start trying to look at condition and check all the different things you need to. And then ultimately, of course, we recommend they can use us, because we help pre-screen and eliminate those cards that have flaws for customers.
Yeah, that's a cool service. And again, that's available through our bulk submission grading deal here. We've got baseball cards through Sports Card Investor. If you go to sportscardinvestor.com, click grading, you submit your cards through there, and then Joe's team will actually pre-screen them all. So they'll actually look at every single card, and if they see a card that has obvious defects that they think, there's no chance this card is going to get a good enough grade to really make it worth your grading fee, they'll let you know, and they'll actually ship the card back to you and not charge you the grading fee. That's a really nice service, because if you send that card direct to one of the grading companies, they're going to grade it no matter what, and you're going to end up paying for that grading no matter what. You may regret it when that card comes back, if it comes back in a low grade. So that pre-screening is a really valuable service. Yeah,
I have a funny story. I have a friend who, he was an employee for a while, then he left to go work at a grading company, and he said, I felt so bad. He said, because I would see these cards come in, and he was used to, for 2 years with me, rejecting those cards. And of course, now his job was to grade them no matter what it was. And he said, I would see cards come in and go, oh, I feel so bad for this guy, because this is going to get a terrible grade and he's wasting his money. But obviously he was in a different role then, and you just grade every card that you see. So we're thankful to be able to help customers in that way and try to save them money on the front end.
For sure. So first of all, understand the secondary market values, as Joe said, to make sure that it even makes sense to submit a card for grading. And the Sports Card Investor app is a great free resource to help you out with that. The Sports Card Investor app, which you can download in the App Store for free, has hundreds of thousands of cards, and you can go to every single one of those cards, and in many of them, we track the raw condition of that card and what it sold for recently in raw condition. And then we'll tell you what it sold for in, like, let's say, for example, a PSA 9 or a PSA 10. You can't assume that your card is going to get a perfect gem mint grade. You cannot assume a PSA 10. And I see too many collectors and investors just assuming a card's going to get a PSA 10 and looking at that PSA 10 grade.
Right.
Even if a card looks really good to you, it's probably more realistic to look at the PSA 9 pricing before deciding to make the decision to submit. Because even if a card looks perfect, still a decent shot. It may just get a PSA 9 because those graders are going to look at it a lot more closely than you are under magnification. And so don't automatically assume a PSA 10. But if you look at the spread between the raw price and a PSA 9 and a PSA 10, and if you feel like the price for grading justifies the fact that, yeah, you know, as long as this card gets a pretty good grade, it's worth the grading fee for me to submit it, then you've got a card, you know, that you can submit off to grading. And the same is true. You can look at that spread on PSA. You can look at that spread on BGS. You can look at that spread on SGC or CSG to understand what those cards are commanding, you know, in different graded conditions on the secondary market versus raw. And if there's enough of a difference there, then you may have a card that is worth grading and paying the grading fee for. So then, as you said, the next step is to really understand the condition. And we did a whole video where we went in detail through how to assess the condition of the cards. We're going to link to it for you. So if you want to go back and watch that video, you can. And we'll show you in that video in a lot of detail. But briefly, there are 4 main areas that the graders look at. Walk us through each of those areas and what somebody needs to look at when assessing their own cards.
Well, Jeff, the first thing, of course, is centering. For me, I take a card, when we're pre-screening for customers, we look, is the card well centered? I learned this the hard way with my very first PSA submissions back in 1998. At the time, I was a huge buyer of Tony Gwynn rookies, which are very often way off center. And I bought all these beautiful mint Tony Gwynn rookies, and I kept getting back these grades off center and so forth. I'm like, I don't get it. And then I'm like, oh, now I get it. And so I quickly learned how to measure centering visually very quickly. So that's the first thing that pops for me.
Yeah, and you got to look at centering as well, not just left and right, which is what a lot of people look at, is the image centered in the card left to right, but also top to bottom.
Exactly.
And sometimes you can have a card that's centered in the middle from a left to right standpoint, but is shifted too far up or shifted too far down, and that will throw off your centering grade as well. The back of the card also matters. It matters less than the front of the card.
Yeah, much less.
They give more of an allowance on the back of the card. The front of the card is what you need to pay the most attention to, but make sure to look at all aspects of centering.
Yeah, so the Jordan rookie is a perfect example as well, because those can be off center left to right, top to bottom, and it makes a huge difference. Even within a grade, you know, you can have a 7 that's perfectly centered, or you can have a 7 that's a little bit off center. That makes a difference in the resale as well. So, but yeah, when you're examining your cards, first thing I look at is centering, focusing primarily on the front, trying to say, is that image perfectly centered? I mean, even Prism cards the last few years in basketball are notoriously off center, left to right. And, you know, there's so many Zions out there with a 70% border over here and 30% over here. And so that's the first thing we look at. And then the next thing that's pretty obvious, especially if you're talking vintage, is corners. And you want to check corners both front and back. And it's also great to use a 10 power loop magnifier to look at the corners closer up, because you'll see the damage, see the issues with them much easier than you will with the naked eye.
Yeah, and you can oftentimes spot corner issues better by turning the card over and looking at the back.
Right.
You know, there's several times when I've looked at a card on the front and it looks the corners look sharp, but then I turn it over and look at the back, and I can actually see that one of the corners looks dinged when I look at the back of the card.
Yep, exactly. And then, of course, from corners you move on to edges. And edges, you can look for notching, you can look for chipping, you can look for frayed edges, especially if you go back and you're talking vintage. Let's take a 71 Topps card with a black border. You'll often see a little cardboard residue. You can see if it's not a clean black border, if it wasn't cut properly, you'll see a darker, you know, cardboard pop from behind that black border. And so that's a very common problem on older issues. Not so much on your Chrome and Prism card stocks. Usually the edges are pretty clean, but that is something to be aware of, especially the further back you go in time with your cards. Pay attention to edges.
Yeah, yeah.
And then, of course, finally, we've got surface, which is probably one of the most overlooked issues. I had somebody come in recently. I can't remember if it was a Henderson rookie, but it was an early 80s rookie, and I just remember them saying, it's absolutely flawless. And I'm like, no, there's a print dot right there. And their corners were great, their centering was great, their edges were great, but it had a little print dot. And so surface, whether that means a printing registration problem, a print dot of some type, whether the card's out of focus or whatever, or whether it's an actual flaw in the surface, like a scratch or a bump or a divot of some sort. There's a lot of things, a lot of issues with the surface, and especially with modern cards, you have to look at the back, because a lot of like the Prism card stocks have these vertical, looks like a clear print line, but that is an issue in the surface. And a lot of them also had, I remember getting back way too many, getting back some Ja Morant and Zion Prism rookies, and the first couple came back with like a 6, and I'm like, wait a minute, what did we miss? And sure enough, I flipped it over, and on the back there was a knot, looked like a fingernail notch in the back of the Prism card. And as soon as we caught a couple, we knew from then on, and we stopped so many customers sending key 1920 Prism rookies that had this little notch in the back of the surface that it looked fine on the front. You turn over and just this little mark, something in their machinery was catching some of them. And so you've got to pay attention not only to the printing issues, to actual flaws in the content of the surface, but you got to check the back out as well.
Yeah, and oftentimes finding the surface issues is best done through magnification, through looking at it in front of a really bright light and turning it off and in front of the bright light. And it can be hard to detect, as you said. Even some of the refractor patterns, some of the parallel patterns that they print on cards. Yeah. I had at the National, I took a really high-end Tua card to get graded that I had pulled out of a box earlier this year on this channel, and the card looked perfect to me, but it had a really kind of fancy parallel pattern on the front of the card, and I was worried because the middle of the pattern kind of cut off a little bit, and there was a gap between the different parts of the pattern, and I was like, I wonder if they're going to consider that a kind of a print line and downgrade the card as a result of it. Sure enough, I got it back as a PSA 8, when otherwise it would have been a PSA 10, but PSA knocked that grade down. In my opinion, they likely knocked it down by 2 grades because there was a defect in the printing pattern of that parallel that they added to the card. So you've really got to pay attention to those types of things because they can make a huge difference as to whether it is worthwhile for you to submit a card for grading or not.
Yeah, like the 1819 Hyper Prisms, I bought a complete set of those, the basketball, and card after card, it had those huge manufactured print lines that screwed up the pattern, and sure enough, we're like, nope, can't grade that, can't grade that, can't grade that, because it was just a common, consistent issue, with printing. So again, that's straight from the manufacturer. Yeah. So it can be, whether it can happen after the fact or in the printing process, there's a lot to examine in the surface.
Yeah, and if you are going to grade a card like that, because sometimes you want to grade it anyway. Right. Sometimes it's valuable enough where you want to grade it just to get it authenticated. 2 options would be, you could send it into a company like PSA and say, just authenticate it. Don't give it an actual numerical grade, and then they'll put it in a slab and say it's an authentic card. Another option is for a card like that, I do like to use BGS because with the subgrades, people can see, okay, this card does have a surface issue, that's a lower score. However, maybe the centering is high, maybe the edges are high, maybe the corners are high, and so then at least on the secondary market, people are going to be a little more willing to say like, okay, overall, this is still a really nicely conditioned card. It just had a print defect, and the subgrades through BGS will expose that, which I prefer. Okay, so if you want to know more about how to look at all of these elements of how a card is graded in detail to inspect cards at home, and if you want to also learn how to pack and submit your cards for shipping, there's a couple of great videos on this channel from earlier this year that I did with Joe. We're going to link to those in the comments so that you can go back and watch those videos if you want to delve into those topics in a lot more detail. And of course, as Joe mentioned, if you submit your cards through our bulk submission grading service at Sports Card Investor, we will look at those elements for you. Go to sportscardinvestor.com and click grading. Okay, a few more questions before we wrap up, just to kind of touch on a couple of last topics here. First of all, autographs. If you have a card that is autographed, if you want to get that autograph authenticated or graded, what's the best way to go in terms of that?
Well, BGS has been very popular with that service for a long time for doing their autograph subgrade. PSA does offer that through their Dual Express service. And SGC, one really cool thing SGC does is sometimes with other companies, people are disappointed, like they get a 10 on the card and an 8 on the autograph, which hurts the overall resale value. SGC right now only does, if it gets a 10 on the auto grade, then they'll add the auto grade. Otherwise, they just grade the card. So it doesn't hurt the resale value. So, which I appreciate that. Some want it, the autograph graded regardless, you know, and BGS and PSA do that. So it can definitely pump up the value of an, you know, if you get a 10 auto on top of a 10 grade, it can definitely increase the value. And I have one customer who, he loves to buy vintage football autographs, Hall of Famers, and he's always like, dual service. And even if they're low grade, he's like, no, I want that auto grade. So that is a very popular component. Now, if we're talking, again, we're talking in-pack autos. If it's signed after the fact, PSA will still do that. Different companies handle it different ways. Like SGC does not authenticate autos at this time. But like PSA, you can send it through their service. They can authenticate and grade, do a grade on the autograph as well. So there are different options out there with each company, but that has become very popular in the industry to get that auto graded as well.
Right. And we've talked, let's talk a little bit about grading scales. So PSA specifically, they have some interesting quirks to their grading scale, right? They're 1 through 10, with 10 being their perfect gem mint. They do have half grades, but only between 1.5 and 8.5. I believe is correct, right? So you can get a half grade, but there's no 9.5 at PSA, unlike BGS and SGC and CSG. There's no 9.5. But PSA adds another extra element to certain cards, and that is a grading qualifier. So that's when you see a grade like a PSA 8 OC or a PSA 9. What are some of the other grading qualifiers?
MC, OF, MK.
PD for print defect. And OC means off-centered. ST. So tell us about what these qualifiers are.
So OC is the most common when a card is too far outside of the parameters of what like a straight 9 has to be within certain centering parameters. And then if it's beyond that, if the rest of the card qualifies as a 9 but the centering is too far off, you'll get a 9 OC for off center. Same thing, it could be an OF for out of focus, so the registries, that you don't see that one very often. PD means it's a noticeable print defect of some type. MK means mark. There's some type of mark on the card. It could be front or back. You know, some type of pen, some type of pencil, whatever. Those ones I've missed a lot on vintage cards, where somebody, maybe they put their initial in pencil and it's buried in the color in the background, and then you're like, wait a minute, I don't, you know, and then you move it long enough and you can see this tiny little pencil mark. And so those are hidden sometimes on there. I'm trying to remember if there's any others we've missed. OC, OF, PD, MK, MC for miscut. Certain issues, if the card is too far miscut, like you'll see on the back. I just got back a 96 Ultra Kobe rookie that was an 8 MC, because front looks really nice, but the back had shifted so far where you could see an edge of another card, so the back was miscut, so it was an 8 MC grade. Yeah,
and what you really need to know about this, especially if you're buying cards on the secondary market, is that if a grade has a qualifier, the card's a lot less valuable than that same grade without a qualifier. So if you think you're buying a PSA 8 Kobe rookie, but it has a PSA 8 MC for miscut, that's not going to be as valuable as a traditional PSA 8. So don't make the mistake of thinking that's a PSA 8 and paying a PSA 8 price if it has a grade qualifier that's going to knock the price down. So always pay attention to that.
Yeah, the typical rule of thumb is that it's often worth 2 grades less.
Right.
So like an 8 OC is often worth more like a 6 than even a straight 7 would be.
Now, we talked about Beckett's grading scale and how they go from 1 to 9.5, and then there's the 2 levels of 10. There's also a BCCG, which is a service that Beckett used to offer. They no longer do, but it is a community grading service, and it has a different scale than BGS or Beckett Vintage Grading, BVG, does. What is BCCG, and why do people need to be careful about it?
Yeah, it can be confusing. It was back in the day, it was Beckett Collector Club Grading. And when they first introduced it, it was a way to have a cheaper service. You could still get a card in a holder from a respected company, but it's a thinner piece of plastic. It's just a white label, not nearly as fancy as a BGS or BVG holder, but the scale is different and it can be very confusing. On their scale, 10 is the highest grade, but it's not a gem mint grade. On their scale, it'll say mint or better for a 10. So technically that's equivalent to a 9, or maybe it's a little better, but it just says mint or better. And then it's very broad. It goes down the scale, like a 9 is near mint or better, which is of course really equivalent to a 7. And then an 8 is X or better, which is really equivalent to a 5 on their other scale for excellent or better. And it goes down. So you will not see like 2s and 3s on BCCG, because I've already explained, by the time you get to an 8, it's already equivalent to a 5.
Right.
So you have to be very careful of those, because you'll see people advertise it. And we've used them in the past when we had a lot of bulk stuff that we wanted to get done at a cheap price point when it was available. But you have to be careful that whoever you're buying from is describing it accurately, because 10 with them is not a gem mint card, 9 is not a mint card, and 8 is not a near mint card.
Yeah, so if you're looking at listings on eBay, for example, and you see a card that's being advertised as a BGS 10 or a Beckett 10, and then you look at the photo and it actually says BCCG, it's not the same thing. Stay away from that card. It's not being graded to the same standard whatsoever at all. Yeah, definitely something to note. We've covered a lot of ground today, Joe, and there's so much more we could talk about when it comes to grading, but this has hopefully been a great overview for you. We're going to once again link to a couple of those older videos that Joe and I did where it does go into a lot more depth about screening your cards, as well as packing your cards and preparing your cards to ship off and get graded, which is another important aspect of the grading process. So check out those older videos, and then of course check out that bulk submission service we have with Joe by going to sportscardinvestor.com and clicking grading on the main menu. We'll save you some money and sometimes get you better turnaround times with the different major grading companies. Joe, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I appreciate it.
Oh, sure thing.
Awesome. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and that bell icon so you are notified as new Sports Card Investor University episodes just like this one are released every Thursday. Thanks, and we'll see you for the next one.